Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Seth, psychologist, and this is my segment, Dr. Seth Explains, from my YouTube channel, Dr. Seth Psychologist. So, in this segment, I basically talk briefly about a psychological process that is complex, or I answer a psychological question that people may have confusion about. And so, this question today is about diagnosis and specifically the diagnosis of a defendant in a criminal proceeding. All right. Now, what is one of the reasons why people in the culture a lot of times will end up talking about a mental health diagnosis or asking questions about the psychiatric diagnosis of someone in a criminal trial? And the answer is because there are a lot of very highly publicized criminal trials. And in those trials, a lot of times what will come up is discussion about the mental status of the defendant. Does this individual have a diagnosis? What is the diagnosis? And you may have experts testify from the prosecution and from the defense about the psychological functioning of the defendant. In fact, when I've done commentary on television on many different shows about criminal trials and the psychological status that we sometimes see, in some cases, actual psychological testing will be reviewed in court. You will have sometimes a testing where the individual takes certain personality tests, for example, and that those are reviewed as a part of the court proceedings. So let's begin by first of all answering the question, how do you get a really good, true, accurate diagnosis, especially when it's a fairly complex psychological profile? All right. The answer is a fairly complex psychological interview. So, to get a really good diagnosis, there is always a clinical interview. So, a mental health expert will interview someone, conduct a mental status exam, get background history, get an understanding of mental health symptoms. That is the clinical interview component. But then, in addition, when there is a really complex case, what you want to do is get psychological testing that can help to render a really accurate diagnosis. Now, some of the tests that are used are tests like the MMPI for short, or the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. In addition, there is something called the Personality Assessment Inventory, or the PAI for short. Now, the PAI is often used when there are issues related to risk assessment or threat assessment. The PAI is often used in correctional and criminal contexts. Why? Because it has specific antisocial and aggression feature scales that can help to provide important information that courts may look at when they consider issues like recidivism. So, the PAI is just one example of a test that may be used to try to get data to give a sense of a truly accurate psychiatric diagnosis of a defendant in a proceeding. In addition, in addition, if there are concerns that someone may, if in addition, if there, in addition, in addition, if there are concerns that an individual may present psychopathic traits, a test like the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR, that particular checklist was developed by Robert Hare, who is really considered one of the foremost individuals in the study of psychopathy in the world. Here's what's really important to understand, though, about a good psychiatric diagnosis that is used in trial. Not every defendant takes psychological tests. So courts do not have the data from psychological tests to review for every single individual that's a defendant in a criminal trial. So you can think, for example, of some very high profile criminal trials, and you can think about, well, what was the psychiatric diagnosis that the testing showed in a particular case? You can think of any number of very high profile criminal cases that took place. Some of them may have had psychological test results that were reviewed as a part of the trial, but many have not. And here's the reason why. Who can force an individual, who can force a defendant to take psychological tests so that the court has some really meaningful data to interpret as the court tries to determine, well, what was this psychiatric diagnosis? Tries to review what really is the mental status of this individual that could help the court understand the motivations behind a particular crime. The prosecution in a criminal trial can't require that a defendant take psychological tests, but the court can. There are some limited instances in which the court can require an evaluation. One example is a competency to stand trial. But here's what's so important. If the competency and mental state of a defendant weren't in question, then the court has no basis to require psychological testing. Here's another point that's important. The attorneys for the defendant's own attorneys, sometimes may encourage their client not to participate in psychological testing unless required by the court because the results could potentially be damaging. Finally, I just want to explain what happens when a mental health evaluation of a defendant does take place. And in this case, the prosecution and the defense can bring in their own mental health experts to interpret the results of that evaluation. And what's really important about that is, of course, there is not always agreement between the prosecution and the defense mental health experts about the actual mental health psychiatric diagnosis of an individual. Psychiatric diagnosis, I can share, is sometimes very complex, especially when you get into the realm of very particular personality disorders and a trauma history. And so, something that you'll see when you sometimes look at really highly publicized media trials, criminal trials that you see all over the news, when mental health and diagnosis is explained, a lot of times you will see the two different sides going back and forth about what the actual psychiatric diagnosis was, because sometimes these psychiatric diagnoses can be very complex to interpret. Now, the more psychological testing data, I believe, as a psychologist of over 20 years, it can often help to render a more accurate diagnosis. But again, as I shared earlier, there isn't always the data from actual long, really reliable, good, valid psychological testing to review. I hope this segment of Dr. Seth Explains has been helpful in trying to understand how, in a criminal proceeding, one gets to a really meaningful, accurate psychiatric diagnosis.